Hey, Shadoe Stevens on American Top 40. The last time they hit number one was almost 22 years ago with Good Vibrations. Now the Beach Boys have caught a chart wave with Kokomo. Their comeback hit reached number 2 just last week and just a sandy beachfront away from number 1. If they shoot the tube to the top this week, the Beach Boys will set a new record for the longest span of time between number 1 songs. The record makers are record breakers on American Top 40.
The hits from coast to coast, American Top 40.
From the rocky coast of Maine to the sandy shores of Hawaii, we do it every week. We count down the 40 biggest hits in the USA. Well, it's time now on American Top 40 for a current hit song written and produced by a man who started out several years ago as the quarterback of his high school football team and who wound up calling the plays for a superstar recording team that's completed 43 passes on the pop charts.
Well, it's been building up inside of me for, I don't know why, but I keep thinking.
And they've sold more records than any other American group in history. Pretty good quarterback. The story begins back in the late 50s at Hawthorne High in California, where the writer-producer distinguished himself as the quarterback of the football team and the captain of the baseball team. He was good enough to go on to a career in professional sports after school if he wanted to, but his first love was music. So after football or baseball practice, he spent most of his afternoons organizing his brothers, a cousin, and a friend into a vocal group. And they practiced constantly until shortly after Brian Wilson graduated from Hawthorne High and started working on his music full-time. Along with cousin Mike Love, he wrote a song called Surfin', and in 1962 that became the first in a long string of hits for the Beach Boys. Since then, they've put a total of 43 records on the charts, and they've sold more singles and albums worldwide than any other American group in the rock era. The total? More than 80 million records, and almost every one of those hits has been written and produced by Brian Wilson. This week, the latest by the Beach Boys, another Brian Wilson, Mike Love composition, is up to number 32, and it's called It's Okay.
In January of 1966, the Beach Boys were finishing their next album, and then they listened to the Beatles' new album repeatedly. So they junked the album they were working on and started all over again. Details coming up.
Casey's Top 40, American Top 40.
I'm Shadoe Stevens, and we've come to the final destination on our whistle-stop tour of the week's biggest hits. The number 1 song in the USA, and a new number 1 steps up on top. By an act who now sets an all-time record for the longest gap between number 1 songs. The record was held by Bill Medley from the Righteous Brothers. Last year, he hit number 1 with I've Had the Time of My Life, a duet with Jennifer Warnes. His last number 1 before that was in 1966, when he had a hit with the Righteous Brothers called Soul and Inspiration. That gave Bill Medley a gap of 21 years and 7 months. Well, this week, Bill's big break between number 1s is surpassed by a group who may just be the ultimate California band. The last time they hit number 1 was almost 22 years ago. 21 years and 11 months to be exact, and this was their number 1 song. Good Vibrations hit number 1 in December 1966. Now 21 years and 11 months later, the Beach Boys are back on top, setting a new record for the longest gap between number 1s. The most popular song in America is by the Beach Boys, Kokomo.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm David Perry, sitting in for Casey Kasem. Now, it was back in January of 1966, the Beach Boys were finishing their next album. And then they listened to the new Beatles album repeatedly. And they junked the album they were working on and started all over again. Up until this point, the Beach Boys had put out surf and sand albums with titles like All Summer Long, Summer Days and Summer Nights, and Beach Boys Party. And that was the sort of happy-go-lucky music they were planning for their next album. But the Beatles had just released an album called Rubber Soul. It wasn't quite like anything the Beatles had done before. It was filled with experimental sounds, multi-tracking, strange instruments, and songs you definitely couldn't dance to. In the words of the time, it blew the Beach Boys' minds. It especially affected the group's leader, Brian Wilson. He says he realized as soon as he heard Rubber Soul that it was time for a change. And so he convinced the band to abandon the album they were almost finished with and spend months intricately crafting their answer to Rubber Soul, an album that's been called one of the greatest LPs in rock history, the Beach Boys' classic album, Pet Sounds. And it's being released as a 4-CD set called the Pet Sounds Sessions, which include every take, every note, every wrong turn and right turn in the creation of Pet Sounds. And by the way, Paul McCartney was so blown away by Pet Sounds that he and the Beatles were then inspired to create their own landmark album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that's our story on one of the most famous albums in pop history, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. 5 years ago this week, the #1 song in the USA was How Do You Talk to an Angel by The Heights. Who'll be #1 this week? We're on our way to the answer as the countdown rolls on.
Casey's